The unexpected prisoner. The spaceship hummed quietly through the cold emptiness of space. A sleek alien vessel, its outer shell dark and menacing, cruised silently through the void. Inside, a group of aliens, towering and ruthless in their advanced armor, gathered around a table in a dimly lit command room. The air was tense, and the feeling of anticipation was thick enough to cut with a knife. They were speaking in their native tongue, their voices deep and harsh as they discussed their mission. Their eyes glinted with excitement as they prepared to deal with their latest prisoner, a human. The human was unlike any other they had encountered. He had been captured during a raid on a far-off colony, his planet's first contact with the alien species. At first glance, he was ordinary, a man in his late 20s, with short dark hair and a simple uniform. He looked weak and unimportant. But there was something in his eyes, something that made the aliens uneasy, though they refused to acknowledge it. To them, humans were nothing but pests, a primitive species that had no place in the galaxy, certainly not among the more advanced and powerful races. They had heard stories of humans fighting back, of their resilience, but the aliens thought little of it. It was only when this human had fought back fiercely and narrowly escaped their grasp that they had decided to imprison him. His defiance only fueled their contempt. Now, they were going to punish him in the harshest way possible. "Take him to the cells," the lead alien ordered. His voice echoed through the room, filled with disdain. "Let him experience the consequences of defying us." The guards moved quickly. The human was shackled and dragged through the cold metal corridors of the ship. His steps were heavy, but there was a fire in his eyes, a glimmer of determination that the aliens could not ignore. As they reached the holding area, they opened the door to a small, empty cell. The walls were thick and reinforced with advanced materials, built to withstand even the most violent of creatures. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, and the faint sound of the ship's engines could be heard in the distance. "Get in there," one of the guards growled, pushing the human roughly into the cell. The door slammed shut behind him, and the human was left standing alone in the cold, dim space. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but he didn't flinch. There was something more to this, something he had not yet figured out, but he knew he couldn't give up now. He wasn't just any prisoner. He was different. Outside the cell, the aliens gathered, watching through a control panel. They had already made their plans. The human was not going to survive what was coming next. "We'll drop him into the lair," the lead alien said with a cruel smile. "It's a place where the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy live. Let him face death. No human has ever come back from there." The lair they spoke of was infamous across the galaxy, a dark, foreboding place where dragons, giant beasts with fire-breathing jaws, had made their home. For generations, it had been a place of fear, a prison for those who were considered the most dangerous of enemies. The aliens knew that the human would be no match for the creatures lurking inside. The thought of the human meeting his end at the claws of a dragon made the aliens chuckle. They were so sure of his fate, they couldn't help but laugh as they prepared to send him there. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that this human wasn't like any other. He wasn't afraid of dragons. He wasn't afraid of anything. He had lived through too much to be broken by something as simple as fear. The human stood still in the cold darkness, taking deep breaths. His body ached from the brutal treatment he had already endured, but his mind was sharp. He knew he had to survive, not just for himself, but for everyone back home. A door slid open somewhere off in the distance, and a bright light suddenly flooded into the cell. The sound of the aliens' voices echoed again, but now they were speaking in a language the human could understand. "It's time. You're going to face the dragons now," one of the guards sneered. The human's heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had no idea what awaited him, but he had faced worse. Much worse. And the idea of a dragon, no matter how terrifying, didn't seem so frightening to him. Not now. The door to his cell opened once again, and the guards dragged him forward. The corridor was cold, the walls lined with alien symbols and strange, glowing lights. Finally, they reached the launch bay. Through the open doorway, the human could see the lair, a vast, cavernous pit, its dark, damp air thick with the smell of sulfur and decay. Massive shapes moved in the shadows, and a low growl echoed from somewhere within. "Good luck," one of the guards said, almost mockingly, before the door to the lair slammed shut behind him. For a moment, the human stood still, letting the atmosphere sink in. The lair was everything the aliens had promised, a place of danger, a place where only the strongest survived. But he wasn't here to survive. He was here to fight, and he would fight until his last breath. Into the lair of the beasts. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the last glimpse of light that had entered the dark cavern. The human, still shackled, was now standing in the heart of the lair. He could feel the oppressive air closing in on him, thick with the smell of sulfur and the faint hint of something far more dangerous. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, rocky, and damp, sending small tremors of discomfort through his body. The shadows around him shifted, and with it, the soft scraping noises of claws on stone began to fill the air. The dragons, massive and terrifying, were closing in. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, their presence undeniable. The stories of these beasts, creatures of fire and fury, of unchallenged power, rushed through his mind like a storm. But none of that mattered to him now. He stood there, motionless, his senses alert. The dragons were not the only creatures in the lair. He could hear something else, something far less obvious, but just as dangerous. His own heartbeat, steady and calm, even as the tension in the air rose. The dragons were circling him, their scales shimmering faintly in the darkness. He could hear their breathing, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the ground, almost shaking the very bones of the ship. Their eyes glowed with malice, two pools of red that glinted in the shadows. But the human wasn't afraid. Fear was something he had long ago learned to suppress. The soft clink of his chains, the only sound that marked his movement, suddenly became deafening in the silence. His body was ready for action, ready to move, to fight, to survive. A low hiss echoed through the lair, and the human could feel the heat rising. The first dragon had shown itself. It was enormous, its head nearly as large as a boulder, with glowing eyes and rows of teeth like daggers. It opened its mouth and, with a deafening roar, shot a stream of fire toward him. Instinctively, the human dropped to the ground, rolling just in time to avoid the blast of heat that scorched the air. The fire roared above him, crackling as it consumed everything in its path. The ground where the flame had hit glowed red-hot, the heat radiating from the earth as if the very lair itself were alive. The human's breath came quickly as he pushed himself to his feet, his shackles rattling. He'd need to move quickly if he was going to survive. The dragons may have been dangerous, but they were not invincible, and neither was he. Suddenly, a new noise broke the silence, a strange, echoing screech. The human turned just in time to see another dragon descending from above. It was smaller than the first, but it was just as deadly. Its claws scraped the stone as it landed, sending dust flying into the air. Its wings flapped, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. But the human had already made his move. Without hesitation, he lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the sharp claws that reached for him. He slammed his shoulder into the stone wall, barely managing to catch himself before he tumbled into the abyss below. The dragons may have been faster, more powerful, but the human had one thing they didn't. He had the will to fight, to survive, to kill. He pulled himself back to his feet, his legs wobbling from the effort. The pain in his side was sharp, but it was a small price to pay for the chance to escape. He needed to find something, anything, that could give him an edge against these monsters. And then he saw it. At the far end of the lair, a weapon, a large, jagged rock embedded in the stone wall, caught his eye. It was a crude weapon, but it was better than nothing. He ran toward it, his shackles clinking with every step. The first dragon roared again, its eyes following his every move. The human could feel its fiery breath as it exhaled. But he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. Just as the dragon leaped forward, aiming to strike, the human reached the jagged rock. With all the strength he could muster, he yanked it free from the wall. The weapon was heavy in his hands, but it was sharp, jagged, perfect for combat. He spun around just in time to block the dragon's claws with the rock, sending a shockwave of pain through his arms as he collided with the beast. The dragon let out an ear-piercing screech, its wings flapping wildly as it recoiled. The human didn't hesitate. He struck again, aiming for the dragon's underbelly, where its scales were weakest. The rock sank into the creature's flesh, and the dragon roared in agony. The human pulled back, sweat dripping down his face. He was winded, his muscles aching. But he had done it. He had fought back. The other dragons circled, wary now. The first had been wounded, and it was clear that they were no longer certain of their superiority. They were still dangerous, still incredibly strong, but now they were uncertain, and that was all the human needed. He took a step back, holding the jagged rock in front of him, ready for whatever came next. The dragons were not the only predators in this lair. He knew this, and he could sense that something much bigger was waiting for him in the shadows. But for now, he had the upper hand. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The monster awakens. The human's breath was labored as he stood in the center of the dragon's lair, gripping the jagged rock tightly in his hand. His body was sore from the battle with the dragons, and his movements were slower now, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. The dragons, though wounded, were regrouping, their massive bodies circling him with a low growl that reverberated in his chest. The heat of their breath lingered in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. He knew the dragons were no longer the greatest threat in this lair. The true danger was lurking in the shadows, waiting. A soft scraping sound echoed across the cavernous space, so faint at first that it could have been the wind. But the human knew better. The lair had no windows, no way for the wind to enter. This was something else. Something alive. Something far more terrifying than the dragons he had just fought. The air became unnaturally still. The dragons stopped moving, their eyes locked on the darkness at the far end of the lair. They could sense it too. It was as if the very stone around them held its breath, waiting for what was to come. The human's grip on the jagged rock tightened. His instincts screamed at him to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. He had to face this. He had no choice. And then, as if the very air itself had shattered, a roar filled the lair, a deafening, bone-shaking roar that made the ground tremble beneath him. The dragons shrieked in terror, and the human felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. From the shadows emerged a creature far more terrifying than any dragon. Its body was covered in thick, spiked armor, its eyes glowing a menacing green that seemed to pierce the darkness. Its massive form dwarfed even the largest of the dragons, and its roar was one of pure fury. This was no mere beast. This was a predator unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The dragons, usually so fierce, backed away, their eyes wide with fear. The human could see their terror, something even they were afraid of. This was the creature that had ruled the lair, the one the aliens had never expected to exist. But the human wasn't afraid. He stepped forward, his legs shaking, but his resolve firm. This was what he had been waiting for. A real challenge. Something worthy of his full strength and skill. The dragons may have been monsters, but this creature was something else entirely. It was a force of nature, a true killer. The creature's gaze snapped to the human, its glowing green eyes locking onto him. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. Even the dragons, once so powerful, now stood frozen, watching. The human's heart pounded in his chest, but his focus never wavered. He had faced danger before, but this was something new. The creature let out another roar, louder than the last, its massive claws scraping against the stone floor as it advanced. The dragons, still terrified, scrambled to retreat, but the human stood his ground. With a swift movement, he lifted the jagged rock and hurled it toward the creature's face. It struck the monster with a sickening crack, but it barely seemed to notice. The creature's skin was like armor, impenetrable to the crude weapon the human had. The creature bellowed and lunged toward him, its massive jaws snapping shut with terrifying force. The human dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the deadly bite. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. He had no weapon strong enough to defeat this beast, but he had something else: his mind, his training, and his relentless determination. The human darted forward, closing the distance between him and the creature. The dragons were no longer a concern. They were too afraid to get in his way. He waited until the creature was about to strike again, its claws slashing toward him, and at the last moment, he dodged and grabbed onto its outstretched arm. Using every ounce of strength he had left, he wrenched the creature off balance, sending it crashing to the ground. The monster roared in anger and pain, but the human didn't hesitate. He climbed onto the beast's back, using the spikes in its armor to keep his grip. The creature thrashed beneath him, trying to throw him off, but the human held on tight. With a swift motion, he brought the jagged rock down into the creature's neck. The monster's roar was cut short, its movements slowing as the human's strike found its mark. The creature let out a final growl before going limp, its body collapsing beneath the human's weight. Breathing heavily, the human stood over the fallen monster. His body was battered and bruised, but he had done it. He had defeated the real monster. The dragons, who had been watching from the sidelines, now approached cautiously, their eyes wary. They seemed to understand that the human was not just another prey for them to consume. He was something else, something far more dangerous. The human looked down at the slain beast, his expression unreadable. The lair was silent once more, the only sound the soft crackling of the dying fire. But deep inside, the human knew that this was far from over. The dragons may have learned to fear him, but the galaxy had yet to see the true power of humanity. And if anyone doubted the strength of the humans, they were about to learn just how terrifying it could be. The aliens' regret. The air in the cavern was thick with tension, the silence deafening after the last, echoing roar of the defeated monster. The human stood victorious, bloody but unbowed, the jagged rock still gripped tightly in his hand. His breath came in heavy gasps, but his eyes burned with something more than exhaustion. He was alive, and he had proven something important. Above him, the dragons circled warily. Their eyes were filled with a strange mixture of respect and fear. They had never encountered anything like him, an opponent who did not just survive their deadly attacks, but fought back, taking down the very monster they had feared for so long. They may have been the fiercest creatures on this planet, but in the presence of the human, they were no more than frightened animals. The human wiped blood from his brow, his thoughts turning back to the aliens who had thrown him into this hellish lair. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated humanity. And now, the aliens would learn exactly what that meant. Somewhere, far beyond the cavern, in the cold depths of space, the aliens' commanders were watching. They had made the decision to test this human, this Dithworlder. They had thrown him into the dragon's lair, believing him to be nothing more than a tool, a subject for their cruel entertainment. The humans were known for their destructive potential, yes, but they had no idea what they were truly dealing with. A communication signal was sent, reaching the alien ship orbiting high above the planet. The commander aboard the ship watched the footage in disbelief. The human had done the impossible. "You said he would die," the commander hissed to his subordinate. "You said he would be no threat." The subordinate, a large insectoid creature, twitched nervously. We did not anticipate the human's strength. He is not like other Deathworlders. Enough, the commander roared. "Do you understand what you've done?" The humans, They. But the commander's words were cut off by a new report. The human was not done. His actions in the lair had drawn more attention than expected. He had killed the most terrifying creature they knew. And now, the lair was filled with dragons who were watching him like prey, but also with the respect of those who had witnessed his strength. The word would spread. The humans were no longer to be underestimated. The commander turned sharply toward the view screen, and in that moment, his confidence faltered. They had thought the human was a joke, a specimen to be discarded, a worthless thing meant to be tested. But now, they were facing something far darker. They were facing the wrath of an entire species they hadn't even begun to understand. "Prepare the fleet," the commander hissed. "The human will come for us." The awakening fury. The human stood motionless in the middle of the dragon's lair, his every muscle tense. He could feel the weight of their eyes, the silent dragons watching from the shadows, unsure of what to make of him. They had expected him to crumble under the pressure, to cower in fear like every other creature they had thrown into this dark pit. But instead, the human had done the unthinkable. He had slain the dragon, and now, he was the one standing tall. His breath was steady, but his thoughts raced. The aliens had made a mistake, one that they would soon regret. They had underestimated him, and in doing so, they had underestimated humanity. His hand tightened around the jagged rock he had used as a weapon. The taste of victory was still fresh, but it was only the beginning. The real battle was just starting. The dragons may have backed off for now, but the aliens were watching. They were planning their next move, and he knew they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the lair. The human's eyes snapped toward the sound. One of the dragons, larger than the rest, stepped forward. Its scales shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes locked onto the human with an intense focus. This was no ordinary dragon. This was the Alpha, the leader of the pack. The human didn't flinch. He had faced worse. He had fought and survived against impossible odds, and now he was ready to face whatever challenge the universe had to offer. He had already proven he could survive in this hellish pit. Now it was time to prove that he could take on the galaxy. The Alpha Dragon let out a low, rumbling growl, its massive jaws opening wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The human stood his ground, his eyes narrowing. He knew that this battle would be different. The dragon was no ordinary beast, but he wasn't an ordinary human either. With a sudden roar, the dragon lunged at him, its massive claws reaching for the human's throat. But the human was faster. He ducked, rolling to the side, narrowly avoiding the dragon's deadly claws. He sprang to his feet and grabbed the jagged rock once again, now using it as a blade. The dragon hissed in frustration and circled around, waiting for the human to make his next move. But the human wasn't about to let this dragon dictate the terms of the fight. He charged forward, his mind focused, his heart pounding in his chest. The dragon lunged again, its teeth snapping inches from the human's face. But the human was ready. He sidestepped, delivering a powerful blow to the dragon's exposed side. The creature howled in pain, staggering back. The battle raged on, each side testing the other, each move a deadly dance of survival. The human was relentless. Every time the dragon thought it had the upper hand, the human found a way to escape, to strike back harder. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for something greater, something that the aliens could never understand. As the fight dragged on, the human's exhaustion began to show. His movements were slower, his breaths deeper, but his will was unbroken. He had faced worse. He had survived things that no one should ever have to. This dragon, it was nothing compared to the horrors he had already endured. The dragon, sensing the human's fatigue, grew more aggressive. It lunged again, this time with a speed and force that would have crushed most opponents. But the human, his senses sharpened by years of battle, dodged just in time, grabbing the dragon's massive leg and using it as leverage to flip the creature onto its back. The dragon let out a shriek of fury, struggling to free itself. The human wasted no time. He lunged, driving the jagged rock deep into the dragon's vulnerable underbelly. The beast's roar echoed through the lair, but it was cut short as the human's weapon found its mark. The dragon convulsed once, then fell still. The human stood over the fallen beast, chest heaving with exhaustion. He wiped the sweat and blood from his face and looked around at the other dragons, who had been watching the entire battle in stunned silence. They knew it was over. The Alpha was dead, and the human, he was the real monster. The air was thick with tension, but the dragons no longer saw him as a threat. They saw him as a force to be reckoned with, something beyond their understanding. And that, in itself, was a victory. But even as the dragons stood back, wary and uncertain, the humans' thoughts were already turning to the next battle. The aliens had watched him kill the dragon, and they would be coming soon. He knew they wouldn't stop until he was dead, but he was ready. The real fight was just beginning. He had proven his worth to the dragons. Now, it was time to prove it to the universe. The alien's wrath. The human stood amidst the silence, his breath steady but his heart pounding. His eyes remained fixed on the lifeless dragon at his feet. He had just slain a beast that was revered as one of the galaxy's most terrifying creatures. His body was covered in blood, both his and the dragon's, but his spirit was unbroken. But the victory was far from over. He could hear the hum of alien ships approaching in the distance. The aliens had seen his victory, and they weren't about to let it slide. The lair, once a dark, quiet cavern, was now filled with an unsettling energy. The air was thick with tension, and the human could feel it creeping into his bones. The dragons may have backed off for now, but the real fight was coming. He could feel it. As he stepped over the dragon's carcass, his mind raced. The aliens were smart. They weren't just going to send more dragons. They would bring their full force. They knew they couldn't afford another mistake. The human had shown them that. He had proven that even in a world full of monstrous beasts, he was the one they should fear. Suddenly, a low, mechanical hum filled the air. The human's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, locking onto the approaching alien ships. They were coming, swift and silent, like shadows in the night. He didn't have much time. He had to prepare, and fast. But there was no need for weapons. He had already shown that a mere human could be the deadliest force in the galaxy. The aliens had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. He knew what they wanted, his capture. They needed to break him, to bend him to their will. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. The human had faced death before. He had fought battles on planets so hostile that no living being should have survived. He had endured pain, isolation, and fear. And now he was a force of nature, unleashed and unstoppable. The ships were closing in, and the human had to make a decision. He could hide, run, and try to evade capture. But no, the human had never run from a fight. Not once. Instead, he made his way to the center of the cavern, where the dragons had gathered. The remaining creatures watched him with uncertainty, their eyes gleaming with both fear and respect. The human had proven himself. He had slaughtered their alpha. But they saw the truth. He was stronger than any of them. He stood tall, facing the dark sky above the lair as the sound of the alien ships grew louder. The human knew that the true enemy was not the dragons, nor the beasts of the galaxy. It was the aliens who had made the mistake of locking him in here in the first place. And now, it was time for them to pay. From the darkened cave entrance, the human could hear the first sounds of the alien landing. Their heavy boots echoed through the cavern, the sound of their approach shaking the ground beneath him. He didn't flinch. The air was thick with the smell of blood and dust. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach. This was it. This was where everything would change. The first alien to appear stepped into the dim light of the cave, a tall, humanoid figure clad in black armor. It looked at him, its red eyes glowing beneath the helmet. The alien spoke in a language the human couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, condescending, mocking. It had no idea who it was dealing with. "You think you can challenge us?" the alien hissed. "You think you can stand against the might of the Empire?" The human smirked, taking a step forward. He knew this was going to be a fight like no other. But there was something else. The humans had been underestimated time and time again. They were the underdogs, the forgotten species. But they were not weak. Far from it. "No," the human replied, his voice cold, filled with an edge that echoed in the cavern. "I don't think I can challenge you." He paused, a dark glint in his eyes. "I know I can." Without warning, the human lunged, moving faster than the alien could react. In a split second, the human was on top of him, using his strength and skill to overpower the alien's advanced technology. The alien struggled, trying to throw him off, but the human was relentless. He had fought worse battles, had faced enemies who had far more power and advanced weapons, but he had always come out victorious, and today would be no different. The human's hands wrapped around the alien's throat, squeezing with all his might. The alien's glowing eyes widened in panic as it realized just how dangerous the human truly was. It clawed at the human's arms, but it was no use. The human's grip tightened, and with one final violent motion, the alien collapsed to the ground, lifeless. But this was just the beginning. The human could hear more ships landing, more soldiers approaching. He had taken down one alien, but there were more to come. And as the human looked around, the dragons, the creatures that had once seen him as a threat, now watched him with a new understanding. The human was not just a survivor. He was the true beast, the one they should have feared from the start. The aliens would soon learn the truth. The humans were not to be underestimated. And this human, he was just the beginning. The reckoning. The distant rumble of more alien ships grew louder, signaling the arrival of reinforcements. The human, standing tall above the fallen alien, did not flinch. His body was a mixture of blood and grime, his expression hard and resolute. There was no turning back now. He had proven his strength once, and the galaxy was about to witness it again. The air around him thickened with a heavy scent of fear, a fear not only from the dead alien at his feet, but from the rest of the approaching invaders. The human knew what was coming. The aliens would not just throw more soldiers at him. They would bring their worst. But he was ready. In fact, he was more than ready. As the ships touched down, the ground beneath him vibrated with the heavy impact. The human could hear the metal clanging of alien soldiers disembarking. They had no idea what they were about to face. They thought he was just another prisoner, someone to break, someone to humiliate. But they were mistaken. He wasn't just another prisoner. He was a force of nature, a predator in a galaxy full of prey. The dragons watched him from the shadows, their massive eyes following his every movement. They had seen him fight and survive. They knew that the human was not like the other creatures the aliens had faced. He had slaughtered their greatest beast with little effort. If they wanted to take him down, it would take more than just brute force. The human turned to face the oncoming soldiers, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. His heart raced, not with fear, but with the thrill of what was to come. He had been thrown into this pit by the aliens, but it was now his arena. The dragons may have been the first challenge, but the aliens would be next. The first wave of alien soldiers emerged from the shadows, their armor gleaming and weapons at the ready. They were a formidable sight, tall, broad, and built for combat. They had seen the footage of the humans' battle with the dragons, and they had come prepared. They surrounded the human, slowly closing in on him from all sides. The human's eyes never wavered. He studied their movements, his senses alert to every shift in the air. One of the aliens, a hulking brute with a vicious-looking energy weapon, stepped forward. Its eyes gleamed red as it aimed its weapon at the human. The air crackled with electricity, the weapon charging for a lethal strike. "Last chance, human," the alien growled, its voice deep and menacing. "Surrender now, and we'll spare your life." The human's lips curled into a cold, calculating smile. He didn't even blink as the alien's weapon fired. With lightning speed, the human ducked, the blast missing him by inches. He rolled to the side, quickly closing the distance between himself and the alien. The soldiers around him gasped, clearly unprepared for his agility and speed. Before the alien could react, the human grabbed its wrist, twisting with brutal force. The weapon fell to the ground, and the human used the alien's momentum to slam it into the cavern's rocky floor. A loud crack echoed through the air as the alien's helmet shattered upon impact. But the human didn't stop. He didn't need to. He delivered one final punch, and the alien's body went limp. The soldier was out of the fight. For a moment, there was silence. The remaining soldiers hesitated. The human had just taken down one of their own with ease. They were trained warriors, each one skilled in combat, but none of them had faced anything like this human. The human stood, his chest rising and falling with steady breath. "Is that all you've got?" he taunted, his voice a growl of defiance. "Because if that's it, this will be over faster than you can say regret." The aliens exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected a prisoner, but they had found something far worse. A warrior, a monster, a human. And now they had to face him. As they hesitated, the human sprang into action once again. He leaped toward the next alien, his fists flying. The battle was chaotic, fast, and brutal. The aliens tried to retaliate, but the human was relentless, using his surroundings to his advantage. He tossed one soldier into the rocks, sending him crashing into the cavern wall. He disarmed another, breaking his weapon in half before turning it against its owner. With every movement, the human's confidence grew. The aliens, despite their strength and advanced technology, were being overwhelmed by sheer human determination and ferocity. They had thrown him into a cell, expecting him to break. Instead, they had unleashed a nightmare they could never control. As the last of the soldiers fell, the human stood amidst the wreckage, breathing heavily but unscathed. The cave was silent, save for the sound of his own pulse. He looked up at the remaining ships still hovering in the distance, the alien forces still gathering. But he didn't care. Let them come. The dragons, who had remained silent throughout the battle, now began to stir. They watched the human, their eyes full of something new, respect. The human had proven his worth. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was the ruler of this domain, the true predator. And the galaxy would soon learn what it meant to face the wrath of a human who had nothing left to lose. In the shadows, the human smirked. "Come and get me." The final battle had just begun.